This evening's message is the first part of a two-part sermon series on the story of Naaman that we have just read in 2 Kings 5. This evening, we will not be focusing so much on Naaman. We will do that next week. This evening, we instead focus on two contrasting characters, a little maid and the king of Israel, who are involved in this story of Naaman. Both were to bear witness of God, but one character is presented to us as a wonderful example. The other character is presented to us as a wonderful failure. By studying both examples, my desire is that we learn what is it to be, as our sermon title says, to be faithful in all circumstances as a servant of God. It is quite similar to this morning's sermon, studying two characters who reacted very differently to the same thing. Let me now read the first portion, which speaks of this little maid, this young girl, verses 1 to 4. Now, Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone up by companies and had brought away captive of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God that my lord Naaman were with the prophet that is in Samaria, Elisha, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. So someone went to tell Naaman of what the little maid said. Now, as we read of this little maid, this young girl, verse 2 to 4 is not just background information to introduce the main story of Naaman, but here it was a story on its own. Verse 2, this young girl was an Israelite who was captured by the Syrians. And it says that she waited on Naaman's wife, which is a way to say that she was before, and she was always in the presence of Naaman's wife, most likely as a maid, a servant. Now, I can't help but relate this story to the story of Ruth. Ruth was a God-fearing foreigner who found herself in Israel. But here we have this unnamed girl, a God-fearing Israelite, who found herself in foreign land. Now, don't you wish we had more to read about this young girl? Sounds like a very interesting story. Now, there are many movies and stories that we love which involves a young girl who found herself on a journey away from home. But despite being away from home, the young girl manages to make an impact, a positive impact on the people around her. Now, we love stories like that, the courageous young girl that helps the people around her. Now, that is what we have here. This little girl, this young girl, was the key to the whole story. If she kept quiet, there will not be any story here. We will not hear of Naaman at all. But here we are, reading the story of Naaman's salvation. We are reading this story here because once upon a time, a brave young girl spoke about God and Elisha to the people that took her away from her home of Israel. It's all quite dramatic, but that is what God does. God brings people together for the sake of the gospel. So this young girl, she is contrasted against two characters. In verse 1, we read at the end that Naaman was described as a mighty man. In verse 2, the girl is described as a little maid. This is a deliberate contrast. The words little maid is not often used in the Bible, but is used here deliberately to contrast against the mighty man. The mighty man will owe his life to this little maid. And of course, another contrast is this little maid to the frightened king of Israel, which we read in verse 7. How different were they in this story? Now let us go into our first point, which is to look deeper into the circumstance of this young girl. She was a prisoner captured away from Israel at a young age. Now we are left wondering, how was she captured? Of course, she was not a soldier, of course. So likely she was stolen from her family. Were her parents killed? Now, whatever way it happened, it's a horrifying circumstance for a young girl to be taken out from her homeland at such a young age. From what we read in verse 2, most likely she was captured alone. So, she is someone you would expect to be bitter, to be sad at her circumstance, to be very negative. Perhaps she would be like Naomi in the book of Ruth. She was bitter at her circumstance. She said, "The hand of the Lord is gone out against me." But we don't see a negative, grumpy person in these two verses. This young girl, she was a servant, positive and faithful in her humble circumstance. She was a young girl cut off from the religious life in Israel, cut off from her parents, but we look at her faithfulness and we can only say that this is the work of God. It is God who has preserved her physically and spiritually. Similar to how he preserved Joseph and Daniel, who were faithful people in foreign land as well. So she came to know that Naaman, her lord, had leprosy. And so she went to tell Naaman's wife in verse 3. If only Naaman was with the prophet in Israel, Naaman would recover from leprosy. Now this prophet was Elisha. We can see that her faithful witness of God to Naaman's wife here is rooted in two things: a love for God and a love for her neighbor. She loved God. We all know that sometimes our sad circumstances, our sad trials threaten our love towards God. We are tempted to allow our circumstance to question God's love. If God loves me, why is this happening to me? We question God's love because of our circumstance. Now this girl, she could have complained, "No, God has sent me away from Israel. He has forgotten about me, so I will forget about him." It's time to think about myself and to stop thinking about God. After all, He is the one that has allowed me to be in this sad circumstance in the first place. Now that would be allowing her circumstance to question God's love towards her. Something that we are all tempted to do. Circumstance affecting our faith. Whatever dreams she had was taken away from her at a young age. Now remember, for this girl, it's not just being taken away from the homeland. In the Old Testament, being in Israel meant you were closer to God. Due to the fact that only in Israel you would find God's dwelling place in the tabernacle. So being in Israel literally meant you were closer to God, because that is where God's dwelling place, the tabernacle, was. So being taken out of Israel would have caused any Israelite to seriously consider, has God truly abandoned me? Because being exiled out of Israel is seen as a punishment. But this young girl never lost her childlike faith. She remembered God. Unlike many unfaithful Israelites in this time period, she remembered God, and God remembers her. Through this circumstance, through what we read here, she has revealed what God means to her. This trial has revealed her faith that is preserved despite her trials. And her words to Naaman's wife was not just take it or leave it advice. She was confident in God. She was almost certain that Naaman would definitely recover. No, sometimes when we give advice, we try to manage expectations. We say things like, I cannot guarantee it, but you can give it a shot. But this girl here was direct. She says he would recover him of his leprosy. She had great faith. So this tells us that those who love God, those who truly love God, cannot help but seek to serve God. Now you think about this. Her circumstance of being in a foreign land did not discourage her from being a faithful servant of God. A lesson for all of us to learn. A young girl in a foreign land, far away from her home, still served God. How much more so we call this church our home. How much more so should we avail ourselves to serve God in our homeland, this church? This girl saw that one opportunity to serve God, to magnify God, to exalt God, and she took that opportunity. In this witnessing, she also showed a love for her neighbor. Now, it may have been tempting for her to keep quiet, to let Naaman suffer. After all, he is linked to the people that took her away from Israel. She could have been like the prophet Jonah, saying to herself, "Don't let this undeserving people get to know the God of Israel. Let the Syrians suffer a bit of payback for taking me out of my home. Perhaps this leprosy is God's curse towards Naaman. So let me not interfere in this. Let me step back. Let me keep quiet." She probably saw the idol worship of the Syrians and could have told herself, "Let me keep quiet. Let the Syrians realize that their gods cannot save them." No, she did not do any of that. She did not keep quiet. Why? Because she loved her enemy, like what Jesus commands. She loved her neighbor. And what better way to love her neighbor than to witness for the God of Israel? So, a love for our neighbors must always accompany our love for God. A love for our neighbor that overwhelms our natural hatred for our enemy. A love for our neighbor that overwhelms our natural love for ourselves. And all of this, loving our neighbor, is God's work. We love because He first loved us. You know, as Christians, we are set free from the worldly principle of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. We are called to love the unlovable because God has shown His love towards us. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That is the gospel. And if the gospel does not produce a love for our neighbors, have we really believed the gospel? If this girl believed in the principle of tit for tat, we will not be reading this story here. But we are here reading this story because this girl loves her neighbor. You can imagine it was probably not easy for her to tell Naaman's wife. The place where I live, the place that you took me away from, Israel, there is where the help for your husband is found, in Israel. You know, she had valuable information, and she freely gave this information. She did not negotiate. She did not say, you know, if you give me something, I will give you this valuable information on how your husband can be healed. No, she was generous, freely giving what she had. She had the childlike faith to help her neighbor. And remember, she was probably alone, and alone in this decision to witness for God. No, we are reminded of Esther also. Esther was also an Israelite in a foreign place. But unlike Esther, this girl did not have an advisor, a relative like Mordecai. She was alone. And she was, as she has shown, a brave young girl witnessing for the God of Israel. So it took great faith to come to Naaman's wife and to say what she said. And God did answer her act of faith. Imagine when Naaman was healed and Naaman came back. This young girl would have been the first to rejoice because God had answered her prayer of love towards her neighbor. That would have been an encouraging comfort to her, that God has heard my prayer, that God has not forsaken me. Jesus in Luke 4:27 speaks about this incident. He says, many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet. None of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. So this was a wonderful miracle, and God used this girl to pave the way for Naaman's salvation. God uses servants, faithful servants. A preacher commented regarding this story on this little girl to remind parents that even at a young age, children can remember what you teach them. And not only remember what you teach them, they can use it as well, just like this young girl. This girl may not have had a lot of knowledge, but what she knew, she used it to serve God, to serve her neighbor. And children, this young girl is an example to all of us. Never too young to be used by God. You do not need to know a lot to share about who God is. All you need to know is that only God saves. And for our application right now, after what we have studied, wherever you are, whatever circumstances you are in, God can use you. The world is in darkness, but God can use you as a light for sinners to know Him. 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. This is what the girl did. In a hopeless situation, she only had one hope, and that is the God of Israel. And she showed it to Naaman's wife. And this girl follows the list of people like Moses and Paul, seemingly unlikely servants of God that God used. And Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 1:26-28. Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you are wise according to worldly standards. Not many are powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. Syria was filled with mighty men like Naaman, strong men, wise men. But no one would have expected that this little girl, this Israelite girl, had anything useful to say, to offer, but she did. So let us be faithful in environments that we are tempted to be faithless in, like the young girl. Perhaps in our secular workplaces, that's what we feel sometimes. We feel like foreigners in a foreign land. We feel foreign to the values, the worldviews of our workplace. And it's so tempting for us to loosen our Christian identity. Very tempting. Very tempting. But by doing that, we are reducing our usefulness to God. So let us see this example of this young girl. Let us take our religion, our identity, wherever we find ourselves in. Now moving on, we go to the next character, the next example. The faithless servant in an exalted circumstance. What we find in verses 4-6. Now moving on the story, verses 4-6. So Naaman was informed of the words of the young girl. And the king of Syria told Naaman, Go to the king of Israel and take along this large amount of money with you. And the king of Syria also wrote a letter of recommendation to the king of Israel, saying that this Naaman, I sent Naaman to you. Please heal Naaman. But what is shocking is in verse 7, the strong reaction of the king of Israel, who he reacts very strongly to this situation. This is unexpected. We do not expect the king of Israel to react like that. It was a very ungodly, dishonoring, and unfaithful response. Verse 7. We talked about an unexpected person that God can use, a young girl in a foreign land. But here we see the person that we expect God to use, the king of Israel. God's anointed servant, the king ruling in God's place. We think of great kings like Solomon, King David. Of course, these are kings that God used. But you know that most of the later kings of Israel were ungodly men, including this king right here, who, although they were given such a high position, they did not use their position to exalt God. Right at the start of this book in 2 Kings, right at the start, we read of the ungodliness of the king of Israel. 2 Kings 1, verse 2. And Ahaziah, the king, fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria, and was sick. And he sent messengers and said unto them, Go, inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover. First reaction when he needed help was to go to Baal. That speaks for itself. That tells us a lot about the spiritual situation in Israel and the spiritual situation of the kings at this time. Let me remind you how kings were expected to be godly. Deuteronomy 17:18 says this, When the king sits upon the throne of his kingdom, he shall write a copy of this law in a book. He shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God. So the king was expected to have this close relationship with God. He was called to handwrite the law of God, that he may fear God. So with all that, we come back to the story. So in verse 7, the scene is that Naaman comes to the king of Israel with the letter of request written by the king of Syria. And again, read the reaction of the king. In verse 7, he says, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Consider, I pray you, see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. The question we are asking as we read this part, how did a simple request for Naaman to be healed by Elisha cause such a strong reaction in the king of Israel? Two reasons. First, the king of Israel thought that this was a trap by the king of Syria. You read the end of the verse. He, the king of Syria, seeks a quarrel against me. Now, some context. Israel and Syria were in a cold war. They were not exactly friends, but they were not active enemies at this time. So when he read the letter, he felt scared because he thought that if he cannot help Naaman, if he cannot help Syria, then that is an excuse for Syria to come attack Israel. He thought it was a trap. The second reason is that he thought the king of Syria was asking him, the king of Israel, to heal the leprosy, not Elisha. Remember, healing leprosy was unheard of. So that explains his reaction. Why does the king of Syria ask me to heal leprosy? Am I God? Who am I? Well, the king of Syria did not request for Elisha specifically, but it was implied. He addressed his request to the king of Israel. That is typical diplomatic courtesy between two kings. The king of Syria probably thought, if I want to get the prophet of Israel to help me, it's courtesy to ask the king of Israel first. Let me give some money to the king of Israel to make things move also, so that he can ask the prophet on my behalf. But the king of Israel was unaware of all this. As we look at verse 7 again, we are wondering, how does this king misread the whole situation so badly? Why? Because like many of the later kings of Israel, this king's mind was just on worldly matters, just on politics, just focusing on visible things and not on honoring God. His first reaction was not to turn to God, but to say, am I God to make alive? Imagine if a visitor to church comes to you and asks you for help, and you reply by tearing off your clothes and saying, am I God to help you? That is, of course, a terrible reaction. But that is what we have here. Naaman, a foreigner, has come into the midst of God's people, asking for help. And we see this reaction from the king. The king was supposed to be an ambassador for God, yet he reacted in this way. Again, the king made the whole situation about himself and about politics. Worldly way of thinking. He thought that all these things was happening because the king of Syria is trying to quarrel with me. This king was acting like any other king in the world, not like the king of Israel, God's servant. And you notice his reply actually convicts him of his sin. His reply acknowledged that only God has power over life and death. So why did this king not turn to God, who has power over life and death, just like what he just acknowledged? This king did not know who he was as the king of Israel. It also seems that he did not have a good relationship with his prophet Elisha. Now, the prophet and the king were supposed to work together. Remember David and Nathan? They had a close relationship, but we do not find it here. What a messy situation. We can compare this king and another king, King Hezekiah. Now, King Hezekiah was not a perfect man, but he had a fear of God. One day, King Hezekiah received a threatening letter from another country. And this was his reaction. Isaiah 37:14. Hezekiah received a letter from the hand of the messengers and read this threatening letter. And Hezekiah, his reaction, he went up to the house of the Lord and he spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel that dwell between the cherubims, thou art God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. That was Hezekiah's reaction in his time of trial. So you can compare this king of Israel with Hezekiah and the young girl which we read off. And remember Nehemiah in last week's sermon. He felt helpless like this king. But what did he do? He prayed. He prayed. Now all this teaches us that whatever position we find ourselves in as God's servants, whether you're a king, you're elder, or you're just a young girl, it's not the position that defines us. God seeks to see what's in our heart. Now this king is like an empty shell. On the outside, he has everything. While on the inside, he has nothing at all. The young girl had nothing, but on the inside, she has everything, as she has shown by her faithfulness. She was prepared to show her faith. This king was not prepared to show his faith, if he had any. He was caught by surprise. This king had the opportunity to glorify the God of Israel to the king of Syria and to Naaman. What better way to glorify the God of Israel than to show Naaman and to show the king of Syria that you have come to the right place. You come to the right place in Israel because only the God of Israel can save you, not your gods. Your gods cannot save you because they are not gods. But he blew the opportunity. And it would have been tragic if the story ended with Naaman going back disappointed. And it was sinful for the king of Israel to suspect the king of Syria. Even if he believed that the king of Syria was setting up a trap for him, even if he had no clue what was going on, he should have still prayed to God. For us also, prayer is not acknowledging that you know everything. Prayer is for those also who do not understand their situation, that we commit all our questions to God. Now, our application when we see this king, let us not think that we have nothing similar with this king. Oftentimes, we do not seek God when we need him the most, like this king. For us, think of this. Think about the last test of faith that you went through. The last test of faith that you went through. You fill in the blanks for yourself. Was it the threat of losing your job? Was it the call that you heard of a loved one going to hospital? Was it the test result that went against your expectations? What was your reaction when you encountered this trial? Were you like the king who let his emotions take over him? He just tore his clothes and cried, I cannot do this. Or were you like the psalmist in Psalm 77, who says that in my day of trouble I called upon the Lord, I sought the Lord? Were you like Hezekiah, Nehemiah, who worshiped God despite being in a time of trial? It's easy to say that trials work for our good. It's easy to say that Romans 8:28 is a wonderful verse, but to apply Romans 8:28 to believe that we must seek God in our trials is hard to do. To seek God in our trials is hard to do. We often deny God in our trials. It's so easy to turn away from God. It's so easy to be overwhelmed. Now the question again is this: do you think you react well to trials? A personal question that only you can answer for yourself. You may answer perhaps not. Now that is why we need to seek God daily, so that when trials come, we are prepared to seek God, because we already seek God daily as our habit. The king of Israel, back to the king of Israel, if he was someone who sought God daily, I think his reaction to Naaman would have been very, very different. He would have been prepared to point the way forward towards Elisha, towards God, just like the young girl. Now we come to our conclusion. Let me just give 4 points on this sermon: faithfulness in all circumstances. First, are we adaptable? Are we adaptable so that we can be faithful? Paul in Philippians 4:11-13 says that, For I have learned in whatsoever state I am to be content. I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I'm instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You can see a bit of Paul in this girl. Both are faithful servants. They were adaptable to every situation. Both the young girl and Paul were Israelites who were adaptable to witness to the Gentiles. Both Paul and this young girl traveled great distances and they witnessed to the Gentiles. Now, the word adaptable is not often a word you would use to describe servants. Adaptable. But like what we learned today, are we adaptable in all circumstances? Are we, like the young girl, adaptable to serve God despite her humble circumstance? If you find yourself in a position of being exalted like a king, are you adaptable to serve God in an exalted circumstance as well? We must serve God in times of trial or prosperity, faithful in all circumstances. And to be adaptable, to be faithful in all circumstances, Paul says, it's only through Christ that you can do all these things. It's only through Christ that you find the strength to do all these things. My next point is the example of Peter, the Apostle Peter, the leader of the apostles. There was a point in his life that he was not faithful in his circumstance. That was when he denied Jesus 3 times. Now, denying Jesus in our time of trial is common to us. Paul felt it. And Jesus restores Peter in his time, after his time of trial. After knowing that Peter was faithless towards Jesus, Jesus restores Peter. Again, without Jesus holding us, we are but faithless servants that will fall away. We can do all things only through Christ who strengthens us. Now, as we look at this sermon, we see the faithful servant girl, we see the faithless king. We are reminded of Christ, who is the faithful servant, the faithful king. Christ was the faithful servant. He, like the girl, left his home. He left heaven to come to this world to be a witness for God. He came not to be served, but to serve. And he was faithful to the end, to the cross. Isaiah 42 says that Christ was the servant of the Lord, as the light to the Gentiles. Isaiah 55:4 says, "Behold, I have given him for a witness to the people." This girl was following the example of Christ to be a witness to the people. And the girl's witness came at a cost. Because she was taken away from her home, that's why she was able to witness to the Gentiles. Christ also knew the cost. He knew his mission involved his death, but he was pleased to come. He was hated by Jews, sent to the cross, but he obeyed as the servant of God. And like the girl, he prayed for his enemies. Christ was faithful in all circumstances. At the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing his great trial awaited him, he did not melt down like the king of Israel, but he submitted to God. He was faithful to God. And even Christ, in the testing of his faithfulness, he sought to pray. How much more so we as well? How do we even dare think that we can be faithful servants without faithful prayer? Christ, the faithful servant, faithfully prayed. And in his great time of trial and pain on the cross, he witnessed to the thief on the cross, "You shall be with me in paradise." He was faithful in his witness in his great time of trial, faithful in all circumstances. And he is the faithful king over us, his often faithless people. The faithful high priest interceding for us. Just as Naaman was saved because of the young girl, faithfulness, because the young girl was faithful, so are we saved because Christ was faithful. Only one man ever walked the path of faithfulness perfectly, and that's Christ. And Christ is the object of our hope, the object of faith. He was faithful in all circumstances, and so should we as well strive to be faithful in all circumstances, to earnestly seek this gift of being faithful in all circumstances. May the Lord Jesus make us faithful servants and give us this gift of being faithful in all circumstances. Amen.